To all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on good governance in practice, examples from the cooperative sector. And our presenter today is Kyle White. Kyle White is the educational and engagement lead with Cooperative First. His work focuses on developing and delivering educational and development services for Cooperative First. He is originally from Newfoundland and Labrador and has worked his way across Canada, focusing on community economic development in rural and Indigenous communities. With degree in geography and public policy, Kyle's educational background has focused on community development, governance, and organizational policy. Aside from his work with Cooperative First, Kyle is a volunteer with a Saskatoon Lions Club and serves on the boards of 2 housing corporations. I am now going to pass it on to our presenter, Kyle. And Kyle, you can start whenever you like and share your screen whenever you are ready. And you can go ahead and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name's Kyle. You already know a little bit about me. As mentioned, today I'll be talking about good governance in practice, focusing on examples from the cooperative sector. Before we go a little bit any further, I'll just give you a quick overview of Cooperatives First, who we are and what we do. We're a nonprofit business development organization based in Saskatoon. Our mandate's to work with rural and Indigenous communities across Western Canada to raise awareness of the cooperative business model and to provide assistance to groups that are interested in starting new cooperatives. We also work closely with existing co-ops around issues like governance, policy, member engagement, business operations, things like that. So a whole gamut of services targeted towards folks that are interested in starting or maintaining their cooperative businesses. We've been incorporated since 2016. And we're really a response to the Cooperative Innovation project housed at the University of Saskatchewan, which was a response to the decline in the number of cooperatives that were starting in Western Canada. There were lots of co-ops, of course, being started in the 1920s, 1940s. We see many of those today, largely with our credit unions and our cooperative retail stores. But ever since the 90s, we've seen a really significant decline in the number of co-ops that were starting. And the Cooperative Innovation Project asked, why is that? Why don't we see more co-ops? Is the cooperative business model still a good fit for rural and Indigenous communities in Western Canada? And if so, what's needed to bring the number of co-ops that are getting started back up? So the answer was yes, communities do feel that the cooperative business model is still relevant, but a lot of folks don't understand the model in the various ways that it could operate. People are very familiar with those very recognizable co-ops, the co-op grocery stores, the credit unions, but they're not really familiar with how a co-op could fit within kind of the niche needs that their communities have, whether that's agricultural processing or running a small cafe. So groups really weren't aware of the different models that are out there for cooperatives and how it could really fit into their communities. So Cooperatives First was a response to that. Our organization is to raise awareness of the cooperative business model, talk about the various ways that it can be used to meet needs, highlight the flexibility of the cooperative model, and work with groups providing that hands-on support, providing those resources, and creating infrastructure to ensure that cooperatives can start and groups can kind of lead that development themselves. Our funder is Federated Cooperatives Limited, based here in Saskatoon. It's the wholesale cooperative that's owned by the 170, 180 retail cooperatives across Western Canada. So just an overview of the webinar. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about governance, and particularly governance in cooperatives. And then I want to talk about a model for good governance that was put together by the Center for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. And that'll really be the basis for our conversation today, as it really underpins a lot of the work that we do at Cooperatives First, and the work that we do with communities and different co-ops. And I'd like to go into this model a little bit by offering some stories and some examples from the cooperative sector. In particular, I'll focus on these three cooperatives, the Maple Creek Co-op, the Old Crow Co-op, and the Saskatchewan First Nations Technical Services Cooperative, to highlight how this model for governance can be actualized in the operations and the governance of real organizations that do good work in Canada. So governance, something I think we're all familiar with in one way or another. What is governance? A little while back, Cooperatives First did a podcast with Paul Thompson, who works at the University of Saskatchewan in the Center for the Study of Co-ops, and he filled us in on a fun bit of trivia. The word governance actually comes from an old Greek word that translates into steering a ship. And I think that's really quite a good starting point when it comes to understanding governance. You get a bit of a sense of what governance as a concept really is. In a more practical sense, a definition that we often rely on, and I've seen used in discipline, is who gets to decide what. And certainly this can be found in all aspects of life, whether it is a complex organization like Mountain Equipment Co-op, or our federal government, or even in a relationship with two significant others. Who gets to decide what is an important factor in how decisions are made, how entities function, and how things get done. And bundled up into that are relationships and how different groups of people or individuals relate to one another, how people interact in formal or informal situations. Built into that is, I think, systems of trust, and a belief that doing X, Y, or Z will create impact 1, 2, 3. I think trust and norms in particular is an important part of governance. Also built into that is authority. So obviously making decisions is tied very closely to authority, particularly when you think of things like enforcement, following rules, setting direction, and actually sticking to that and following it and supporting it. But also tied to that is incentives. So the reason people do things is often because there is some incentive for them. And that's absolutely critical, I think, in all forms of governance, whether it's, ensuring that a service is continued to be provided, ensuring that your spouse or partner is happy, or that taxpayer dollars are used appropriately and services are available to the public. There's a whole complex, I think, system that makes up governance in our day-to-day lives, and it's really everywhere. But more importantly for myself is cooperative governance and how governance functions in cooperative businesses. I think, when I talk to people about governance of their organization, they very quickly go to the fairly recognizable elements of governance or characteristics of governance that a co-op would traditionally practice. And that might be the annual general meeting where people get together and, you vote on things and you get to actually make decisions in real time that affect your co-op, whether it's appointing an auditor or electing your board, or voting to amalgamate, which my local co-op here in Saskatoon did recently. Or boards. When people talk about governance and who gets to decide what, I think we often default to thinking about boards of directors, who are tasked with managing a cooperative and setting that direction. But they're really just one part, a significant part, but ultimately a rather small part in how a co-op is governed. I think we often think about the voting structure in a cooperative that's based on one member, one vote, a more equal platform for making decisions in cooperatives. And certainly that's important, but there's a whole pile of different norms and ideas and trusts built into that simple system. And things like patronage dividends, those actual tangible incentives for getting people involved in a cooperative, giving back based on their use of the cooperative. I think we often think of these things when it comes to governance, but it really runs much deeper into the organization than just that. And we start hitting on things like, the actual importance of members and the role that members have in an organization, not just as the people who shape it or the people who patronize it, but really the ones who are fundamental to its existence. There are lots of cooperatives across Canada who are either struggling or have failed that don't really understand the true role of membership and the role that members play in the organization. Certainly the Saskatchewan wheat pool and the issues that it ran into in the 2000s are a very good example of that, of the board and management not fully appreciating the role of members in their co-op. Tied up with things like elections, we see authority being granted to a fairly small number of individuals in the co-op that do make very important decisions. For anyone who's been following the Saskatoon co-op labor dispute story, there's a very good example where a very small group of people, 9 members of a board of directors, have a tremendous amount of authority over 900 employees on behalf of 115,000 members. And that relationship is now changing, for lack of a better term. It's quite an interesting thing to see unfold, how authority gets exercised and really how it gets questioned in that particular case. And tied in with members and authority is loyalty and trust of the organization. Really quite fundamental and gets enacted, I think, in very different ways. But what's really foundational to governance in a cooperative, as with many social economy organizations, is individual versus the collective. Fundamentally, with a cooperative, the role of the group, the members, whatever that looks like, is very much central to how the organization is going to function. And so when we do hands-on work with groups that are interested in starting co-ops, the very first question I'll ask somebody is, are there more than one person involved in this endeavor? For one reason being, you need at least 3 people in most provinces to start a co-op. But the other one is that for any co-op to function properly, you need to have buy-in from that group right from the get-go. Otherwise, you will encounter issues like, a lack of member loyalty, a lack of ongoing support, a lack of patronage, issues that will be quite detrimental to the operations of the co-op. So it's very important to address early on. So the collective rather than individual governance is fundamental. So I'd like to shift a little bit and talk about a model for good governance. And this was created by Murray Fulton, Brett Fairburn, and Jan Poehler with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. And I'll send along the report where this model was first introduced to the RPLC, so it can be made available perhaps in the links of the YouTube video, and you can read more up on it there. But their model really looks at good governance and what goes into making good governance, whatever that is or whatever that looks like. And they do so while looking at a case study of Atlantic Co-op. which is a wholesale co-op owned by local retails in the four Atlantic provinces. Anyone familiar with the case or from Atlantic Canada knows that Atlantic Co-op is no longer in existence. And after a number of tumultuous years, it had to close. Arguably, and the authors of this report do argue, that it's because of a lack of good governance and a bit of a falling apart of these three factors. So just to give you guys, I guess, a bit of an overview from the author's perspective of what these three tenets of good governance are, we'll start with managing strategic interdependencies. So for a co-op to thrive or even to survive, all those involved need to perform their roles. Member loyalty, director strategic guidance, staff productivity, and management expertise are all necessary to surmount the challenges the co-op faces. Good governance gives key stakeholders the incentives, sense of ownership, and rewards to align their behavior with what is needed for mutual success. So again, really highlighting the collective rather the individual, or even the collective coupled with the individual. Acknowledging that individuals are self-interested is quite fundamental, I think, to collective forms of governance. Next, we have developing the right view of the future. Organizations exist to deal with uncertain environments. Investment, production, employment, and marketing plans require views about what the future will bring. Every group of participants has its own filters and ways of thinking. Governance decides whose voice counts and which view of the future will guide the co-op. Success hinges on which view is acceptable and how easily and accurately it can be adapted to changing circumstances. So again, setting that direction, who gets to decide what, absolutely fundamental to the operation of a co-op. Finally, establishing and maintaining legitimacy. The third governance challenge for a co-op is to establish and maintain legitimacy in the eyes of stakeholders. Without legitimacy, policies will be ignored, incentives will be viewed differently, and information may be distorted or not provided, and views of the future will be disregarded. So, if we think about extreme examples, a lot of government revolutions, I think, happen because of a lack of legitimacy or a lack of belief that, the powers that be actually hold power. And the same lessons can easily be true for a cooperative. Holding on to power and making decisions in a cooperative, the legitimacy of that may be called into question by the members or other actors in the co-op, and that can cause a serious problem for good governance. And tied up with all of this, and really in the realm of the work that I do and we do at Cooperatives First, is organizational policy, and how organizations formalize those decisions, and how they actualize and embed good governance and those practices into their organization. And there's several ways that groups can do that. Broadly speaking, it could easily be any decision that a co-op chooses to do or not do, drawing on a Thomas Dye definition of policy. So organizational policy is really quite broad, multifaceted, and includes things like the rules of the organization, whether that be the actual bylaws or the policies created by the board, or simple norms. Whether or not when we're at our co-op grocery store, we stand in line and wait rather than bursting to the front. There are just some things that we take for granted. Or it could be the structure of the operations and how the different actors involved in the organization are told they must interact with one another. Certainly a very interesting point for multi-stakeholder cooperatives, where there are different rights, responsibilities, privileges, and conditions assigned to the different members of a cooperative, and that sets the tone for how they can interact with, benefit from, or engage with the co-op. And of course, all of it is contingent on legitimacy. Whether or not people agree that this is how we're going to go about working together. If people don't agree with it, they simply will take their business elsewhere. They won't get involved. And if enough people do that, and legitimacy is really called into question, then the co-op could die. So organizational policy is absolutely essential for the lifespan of an organization, and it's something that we work very closely with groups on to ensure that they are kind of paying attention to this element of their operations. So let's look at a couple of examples of each of these tenets of good governance, and I'll couple that with a story or two about different co-ops. So starting with strategic interdependencies, one of the key things we do when we start working with co-ops is clearly defining roles and ensuring that people understand what their individual role is as part of a group in a co-op. Some of the biggest issues we have are easily solved if people understood the roles that they have in their organization. Whether that's, relying on the same 4 people to run the board, being burnt out because there aren't enough volunteers, is largely because people don't necessarily understand the role they have in the co-op as a member, their responsibility to help manage the organization by serving on the board. Again, very few people really understand the fundamental differences between a cooperative and other models of business. So having some sort of member onboarding process is a very important policy for organizations that want to overcome either member apathy or things like volunteer burnout. And having things like training can be very useful and can go a long way for, again, ensuring member buy-in, ensuring directors understand their responsibility so that A, they don't overstep, or B, that they are engaged in the fullest extent in making sure that their cooperative is meeting the needs of its membership. And even for staff and managers, understanding how a cooperative works, how it's different, can help shape how members or consumers are engaged and how people work together and are treated and reported to. And of course, the board's role of oversight is fundamentally important and needs to be exercised in a cooperative. So a really great example, I think, of strategic interdependencies is Federated Cooperatives Limited. Anyone familiar with Federated Co-op will know that it's a remarkable organization started by local cooperative stores back in the mid-1900s, and has grown to be the largest company in Saskatchewan with, I think, most recent profits are over $1.1 billion. So any one local co-op, I think, has a great example of strategic interdependencies, and Federated Co-op as the federation is an even more amazing example. And there's a great case study that was written by Paul Thompson at the Center for the Study of Co-ops that really highlights just how fascinating that relationship between the local co-ops and the federation really is. But I wanted to keep things focused in rural Canada for this webinar, so I thought I'd draw attention to Maple Creek Co-op, which in 1982 was really on the brink of crisis. At the time, they had followed the 1970s, which were really a period of aggressive expansion for most of the cooperative retailing system as they tried to capture a larger market share in Western Canada and remain competitive with, the other big players in the retail industry. And they were servicing, of course, groceries, gas, agriculture products, things like that, hugely important for smaller communities. Certainly Maple Creek, being somewhat isolated in southwestern Saskatchewan, would fall into that category. But it found itself owing, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is quite considerable for the time. And since we had just entered the economic recession in the 1980s, was really in quite a bad situation. Coupling all that with high interest rates, and management faced a very tenuous set of decisions to try and get out of there. And they weren't alone in this. Federated Cooperatives Limited, as the federation owned by over 200 associations, had to contend with this sort of challenge across all 4 provinces. In a book written by, or edited by Nora Russell and Brett Fairburn, the chapter focusing on federated co-op and organizational autonomy really highlights the stress and the situation that was facing the Federation of Retail Co-ops. I think they number 36 co-ops were in dire straits and needed direct management support from Federated Co-op, and another 60 or so needed very close support. So it was a rough time for the Federation because of this recession, because of the expansion, because of the interest rates, and in some cases because of bad management. But with Maple Creek Co-op, Federated couldn't really provide the support that was needed because they had all these other challenges that really required their attention. So even though Maple Creek Co-op was in a pressing situation, the situation was far worse for many others. So the managers at the time knew that whatever they decided to do would have to be somewhat drastic. And they knew that they would need member support for whatever this decision would be. At the time, local co-ops are being encouraged to, cut wages, reduce labor costs, close departments, do things that would highly impact the services that members would receive. So the management of Maple Creek Co-op knew that whatever decision they made, members had to be on board with, because at the end of the day, it was going to impact them the most. And simply closing the store wasn't really an option. For the Maple Creek Co-op to close, those folks would have to travel, over 100 kilometers out of their way to access basic goods and services. And for rural people who live outside of Maple Creek, farmers and the like, would have an even more difficult time should the co-op close. So they called, of course, a special members meeting and brought this issue to the members. And as a result, they found that the interdependent groups within the co-op were actually quite aligned. So knowing that the goal of this situation was to ensure that the cooperative survived and was there for the long term to provide services and employment to these varied groups, people understood what had to be done and were in agreement with their role in actualizing that plan. And a big portion of that was raising money. Members would purchase additional shares in the cooperative. One story even mentions that one fellow came in with $40,000 in new equity because he needed that co-op to survive. And employees underwent layoffs as departments closed, and there were pay cuts. But all of this was accepted because each group understood they had to do their part to ensure that the organization as a whole would be there for the long term. And that really got into, I think, the co-op's identity. The fact that it needed the collective to come together, especially in a time of crisis, to ensure that it would be there in the long term and be successful. So with, I think, upwards of $200,000 in new equity and a much more manageable cash flow, the co-op would start better managing this difficult situation. And of course, Maple Creek Co-op is still there today. It's still very successful. And it really demonstrates that in times of crisis and otherwise, fulfilling the roles expected of members, of employees, and of management is instrumental in overcoming challenges, even the most dire. So next we have a view to the future, or setting the course. And there's a number of ways that this can take place in an organization's policy, whether that's effectively communicating to the members what the co-op's doing, why it's doing it, so that people understand and aren't apprehensive or they question whether something's happening, and their questions are answered. Organizational listening, ensuring that members, as the foundation for any cooperative, are helping to shape their organization. Absolutely foundational. Again, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool is a fantastic case of how members can be alienated within a cooperative and how that ultimately leads to its downfall. And of course, there has to be meaningful action and reporting, which is, I think, fairly standard within a cooperative. If you're going to listen to the members and communicate with the members, you need to follow through with what's being said, and there needs to be reporting mechanisms to ensure that folks know what's going on and why they're happening, to ensure that their buy-in is consistent. And a great example of this is the Old Crow Consumers Cooperative. If anyone's ever been there, I'm sure they'd agree that the co-op superstore, as I think it's called locally, is really quite impressive. Old Crow is a community of about 300 people, largely the Vuntutquitchin in the northern Yukon territory. And for years, the community was serviced by the Northwest Company with a northern store, which made quite a bit of money from the cooperative and shipped all that money down south, and didn't really provide the foods that the community needed. There's a very important, the importance of wealth retention in northern communities is very high, but to not get the services that were needed and to see all that money leaving the community was really an enormous loss for those community members. So many folks would actually do most of their grocery shopping in Whitehorse and just pay to have things shipped in. Oftentimes it was cheaper, and because you couldn't get most services in Old Crow from the northern store, this was seen as the more viable option. So when the lease ended for the northern store, or for the Northwest Company, the local council did not renew. And so for about 6 months or so, they were without any store. And this not only meant that they couldn't access groceries or fuel, they were at risk of losing their local post office or their banking branch, their TD banking branch. So they partnered with Arctic Cooperatives Limited, a federation of cooperatives based in Winnipeg that serves, I think there's 34 local co-op associations throughout the Northern Territories and northern parts of Quebec. And they set up a new store. But one of the biggest things they had to contend with was changing consumer behaviors. Many people had, within that period of 6 months and even beforehand, relied quite heavily on paying the freight of shipping goods from Whitehorse into the community and meeting their needs that way. And so in year one of the co-op's operations, I think gross revenue was around $800,000, which really isn't sufficient for a successful operation. And they had to demonstrate that ownership of the cooperative rested with the members, with the community. And it would really take all of us working together to make the co-op a success and to ensure that prices would eventually go down if they had enough purchasing power, and that the co-op could invest in the community and retain as much wealth as possible to benefit the community, and that the members could shape that. So they knew where they had to go. They knew they had to have this organization to provide these goods, to benefit the community, to keep money in the community, and they needed agreement upon that from the members as well. And over time, that started to actually take shape. And just by year two of the co-op's operations, I believe its gross revenue was around $2.1 million. An enormous increase from year one, and a very, very, very fast turnaround to get this organization into the black. And it didn't take long before they could issue patronage dividends to the members and tangibly give them that extra incentive to shop locally by purchasing memberships and buying locally, invest in the community. And the organization listened to its members. Organizational listening was hugely important. instead of allocating all those extra profits to member payouts, the co-op would issue $1,000 checks to new families who just had babies, because they knew it was important and people needed that extra bit of support. And that was a great example of listening to what the members need, what the community needs, and using the cooperative not just as a means of meeting your needs, but investing into the community and responding to the challenges that the community and the membership have. And it's still operational, and it's really quite an amazing story of how a community can come together with the right view of the future and actualize that vision. And finally, legitimacy. There are many ways organizations can go about legitimizing their processes or ensuring that members, boards, management, employees understand and agree with how the organization is going about its various processes and operations. Participation is certainly one of the biggest indicators of that, as is buy-in and acceptance of the rules for how the organization will carry on its business. But of course, adaptation to changes in the environment and ensuring that the co-op remains relevant is also quite huge. And there's different ways that groups can, I think, go about understanding the needs of members, whether that's some sort of forum or feedback forms or the good old AGM. Co-ops need to be listening to their members, understanding their perceptions of the co-op, whether or not they're participating, and how they can respond to ensure that the co-op remains legitimate and authentic as an organization and as a way of doing things. And a really cool example, I think, of this is the Saskatchewan First Nations Technical Services Cooperative here. Well, it's headquartered in Regina, but serves an enormous region of Saskatchewan. It came together in response to a decline, I think, in the services offered by the federal government and a need for consistency in the delivery of technical services for First Nations communities. So things like housing inspections, planning, water inspections, environmental planning, things that are delivered by tribal councils, funded by the government or the federal government, but not necessarily carried out in a consistent way. Many First Nation communities and tribal councils contract out the delivery of technical services across Canada, and that results in a loss of money from First Nations communities. So the Technical Services Co-op was a response to that. It would bring together the 74 First Nations of Saskatchewan to collectively bid on contracts from the federal government. So if a contract was made available to carry out the housing inspections for the First Nations in Saskatchewan, this co-op could make a bid on that and make the arrangements within First Nations communities and tribal councils to ensure that those services are delivered. And it would monitor that and ensure that the consistency of service delivery was there and that the use of money was kept within those First Nations communities. So a phenomenal example of sovereignty, response to the needs of the market, and listening to what was needed from those communities. And we worked with them quite closely to ensure that their governance reflected the very unique actors that were involved in that organization. There were, of course, the 74 First Nations, but then there were 10 tribal agency grand councils that were represented some of those nations, but also deliver those services. So navigating the landscape is very tricky. And a key part of it that we found out when writing their bylaws was that core principle of co-ops around one member, one vote. Having these open democratic elections to determine the board of directors wouldn't necessarily be a good fit. There needed to be that recognition of the existing structure within First Nations governance to get buy-in from those potential members, those First Nations communities and those tribal agency grand councils. And so that was built into the governance structure of the organization, that each participating tribal council would be able to appoint one member to the board of directors, and there'd be an external non-voting advisor and elder who would help guide the decisions of the board. So although the co-op operates like a co-op in just about every other way, how it elects directors and how it's managed on a day-to-day basis is quite different. But that was absolutely fundamental for the legitimacy of the organization. And as a result, there's still that profound sense of ownership over the organization because it reflects First Nations ways of doing things, but is ultimately accountable to its individual members. So just to recap, this is a model of good governance that's been proposed by the Center for the Study of Co-ops. It's one that's really quite important to our work at Cooperatives First and the work that we do with communities all across Western Canada and co-ops across Western Canada. And it's quite multifaceted. It takes quite a bit of work, but it's really helped us wrap our heads around what good governance is and the steps that groups can take to ensure that they are operating based on good governance and are successful in that. So we have worked with the University of Saskatchewan, the Center for the Study of Co-ops, to create a Governance in Cooperatives course. It's offered online freely through Canvas. It started yesterday, but registration is still open. If anybody would like to explore some of these concepts, some different cases a little bit further, that course is open right now. I can send along the links as well to RPLC to share with folks. But if you have any questions about governance and cooperatives, good governance, this governance course, or anything related to governance, I'm quite happy to take those questions. These are the two works that I was relying on for this workshop or for this webinar. And here's my contact information. So thank you guys very much. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now. But if you'd like to follow up with me later, please feel free to get in touch by email or by giving me a call. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Alrighty, thank you, Kyle, for sharing that information with us. It was very informative. During the presentation, I did have two questions come up. So the first question was from Anderson, and his question is, what's your practical definition of good governance?
In the simplest form, I suppose it would be agreement around who gets to decide what. In a more complex form, I think good governance would rely on different groups of people coming together, agreeing on the system for how decisions will be made, and working together to achieving agreed upon goals. I think that would be a good working definition of good governance.
Okay, we had another question from Dan, and his question is, can you identify exactly what types of support does Cooperative First actually provide to a group interested in establishing a new co-op, maybe a residential co-op as an example?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. If you check out our website, cooperativesfirst.com, there's a whole host of the services that we can provide to groups. We do provide hands-on advisory services to groups starting new co-ops, including discussions at the early stages, figuring out what type of co-op this might be, if the co-op models are a good fit, right through to helping groups incorporate their cooperative, drafting their articles of incorporation, drafting their bylaws, and submitting those to the government. We have a small pot of money that can help fund business plans to help groups test the feasibility of their co-op or make a plan of action with a third-party consultant. And we, of course, provide plenty of governance support, both through hands-on advice, but also through our online governance course, as well as our resource website, which is coopcreator.ca. It's, again, a free website with tons of information, tools, templates, or stories of how to operate a cooperative, how to start a co-op, and how to effectively manage a cooperative business.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. So I believe these are all our questions. Do you have anything to add, Kyle?
No, thank you guys so much. Thank you to the Rural Policy Learning Commons and yourself for coordinating this. This is the second time now I've delivered one of these webinars or been a part of one. And they're always quite a bit of fun. And yeah, please check out our governance course. It started yesterday, but you can still register. It is an amazing course with tons of information about governance, good governance, and co-ops.
Okay. I would like to thank you, Kyle, for your great presentation, and as well as the audience for attending and for their participation. Have a great rest of the day, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Groovy. Thanks, everybody.